Good afternoon. That, of course, was the voice of one Bradley Streetcar Pfeiffer. He was one of the co-founders of the Rochester Grangers Vintage Baseball Club. It was founded in 1999. We have at least one member who was a part of that club, the initial club, sitting in the back row, Mr. Mike Cuball Johnson, who's been called by Mr. McKay and various others as the single most recognizable player in vintage baseball history. I probably wouldn't argue with that. We've got some shots today that are a combination. This year's talk is going to expand on last year's. We gave a talk last year on the evolution of baseball. Today, we're going to also give some recognition to clubs that reenact the game as it was played in the early years. So, what I'd like to just kind of get a feel for is how much this group knows about early baseball. So I'll just throw this question out. Anybody have an idea who invented baseball? Doubleday, one vote for Abner Doubleday. Anybody else got a strong feeling about that? I think that it's pretty well established that Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball, although for many years he was credited with inventing the game. Turns out that he was in the military in 1839 when he was supposedly in Cooperstown and invented the game. So there isn't a lot of support to believe that Mr. Doubleday was in fact the inventor of the game. In fact, it's pretty clear, I think, that it probably wasn't invented by any single person. Baseball was thought to be a combination of some English games that came over from across the pond. Cricket and rounders were games that came but with some major differences. Cricket, for instance, is a game that could take days to finish. And Americans, it turned out, didn't have the stomach to play a game that took 3 or 4 days to get a result. Rounders was similar in that it had bases and it had pitching, but one of the main differences was that rounders was played with a flat bat. Instead of a rounded bat with a barrel on it, you had to strike the ball with the flat end of the bat. And it had its own kind of strange rules. One of the rules that rounders introduced and continued on in the baseball game was something called soaking. Soaking was a practice where a fielder picked the ball up, and instead of throwing to a base to retire a runner, he had the option to take the ball and throw it at the runner. If he hit the runner, he wasn't on the base, he could be called out. So as we progress to our study of who invented the game, we come across a guy by the name of Henry Chadwick. He was a sports writer, so right away he's a little bit suspect. People wouldn't automatically assume that he knew anything about the game unless he had some skin in the game, so to speak. And Chadwick was from England. He came over after he'd already begun his writing career, and he was one of the persons who pushed the idea that baseball was a game that was invented by more than one person. So there are a lot of pictures that exist, some photographs and some drawings and paintings that depict a game that looks an awful lot like modern baseball being played in New Jersey. Specifically, Elysian Fields in Hoboken was an area that the game was first thought to have developed. At that time, the New York Knickerbockers were a club amongst a few in the New York area that were playing a game that looks an awful lot like baseball. The first club to publish any rules about the game were thought to be the New York Knickerbockers. That was a club in New York City, and those rules were written by Alexander Cartwright. He was a captain of the Knickerbockers, and if you were to get in a time machine and look at what the game was that was being played in 1856, 5-6, that was a year that the Knickerbockers published their first rule book, you would have seen a game that is very much like the game that we know. In other words, it was 9 innings. There were 3 outs per inning. 3 strikes were allotted to a batter until he had to sit down. And it was the first time that 9 batters were required to supply what was called the side. So it really sounds a lot like the game that we know, with some key differences. One was the spelling of the game, baseball. It was spelled with 2 words, and it was thought that after the game started in the New York area, that the game spread from New York to outside that area into the Midwest, including Rochester, Michigan. It was probable that the games was spread in part by the Civil War, people coming back from the Civil War in the early 1860s, those that were capable. And the first club in Michigan, at least southeast Michigan, that we know about, that were playing rules that were adopted by the Knickerbockers, was a club called the Franklin Club in Detroit. They were pretty successful. So successful that the Rochester city fathers saw this game that was being played in Detroit, and they decided that they ought to sponsor a team. Now, sponsoring a team back in the 1860s, 1870s didn't mean you were contributing money. Usually you were contributing players. And the players at that time were not being recruited for their skill. They were mainly being recruited because they were persons who lived in the city. They might have been someone with some responsibility. They could have been a mayor, they could have been the sheriff. Usually people that could get away from their jobs during the daytime. And so in Rochester, what we discovered is that there are a number of newspaper clippings showing a club called the Grangers was in existence and was playing by 1870. I mentioned Mr. McKay, Patrick McKay, the director of the Rochester Museum, had been digging around in some musty old newspaper clippings, and he got this idea. This was probably around 1998 or 1999, that Rochester could have a vintage team. The idea being, as a representative of the Rochester Museum and his idea of depicting living history, he could put together a club and sponsor the club, so if they needed bats or balls or some equipment, they would have some means of paying for those things. So Mr. McKay kind of put out some feelers as to whether or not this would be feasible in Rochester. Mind you, there were already some clubs in southeastern Michigan. Greenfield Village was a hotbed of vintage baseball. They had a club called the Deux at that time.
This is Mr. McKay.
Barely recognizable there. Mr. McKay decided that he needed somebody to help him with some experience, both playing the game and running a club. And he came across a fellow by the name of Bradley Pfeiffer. Mr. Pfeiffer, whose voice you heard when you came in, singing a song called For the Love of the Game, was a player for the Greenfield Village Nine, notably one of the first players to compete in their league, what was then a league at Greenfield Village. He had recently moved to Rochester, and the two of them decided to go ahead and take a flyer, so to speak, and they put some feelers out. There were people that were connected to the fire department, Mr. McKay among them, and they first made some contacts with firemen. They thought these were people that keep odd hours. They might be crazy enough to play baseball without gloves, without equipment. And sure enough, within a year, they had recruited what became the roster of the initial club for the Rochester Grangers. The idea was that the Grangers would depict baseball as it was played in the 1860s, much like the newspaper clippings depicted it also. And 25 years later, the Grangers still continue to reenact the game as one of the most successful clubs in the Midwest. So what we're going to do today is we're going to mix a little bit of early baseball. Mr. Westgate, who is a member, as I am, with the Vintage Club, the Rochester Grangers, is going to introduce us to early baseball, including the Detroit Tigers. He's got some great pictures. He's got some great tidbits of information you may not know. And before we're done, I think we'll have some fun depicting both the vintage game as it is portraying a much older game played in the 1860s, and we're going to take you all the way up to the modern game. We'll identify some of the rule changes that we think really changed the game and made it what it is today. So, Mr. Westgate, if you would like to fire up your photos, and you may want to go through and identify some of the people that are on the screen, who they are, and what their connection is to vintage baseball.
All right, so we've been scrolling through this slideshow.
You want the mic up here?
And this is a picture of the New York Knickerbockers that wrote the first known rules for the game of baseball, 2 words. And the fellow in the back center is indeed Alexander Cartwright. And John Thorne, who's now the official historian of Major League Baseball, in this book, now says that Cartwright, being the father, might be debunked. They feel that he played baseball for the Knickerbockers, along with these 5 other gentlemen. And during the gold rush, hightailed it to California, couldn't make a living there, and then ended up in Hawaii when it was its own country still, and worked for the Queen. But anyway, it was more of a team of these folks that wrote up the rules, including a fellow by the name of Wheaton and a guy by the name of Holliday, that together they wrote the rules, and in fact they think Cartwright didn't write the rules at all now. So these ideas of the origin of baseball just keep evolving and changing as you see as the time goes on. So anyway, what I found interesting about the rules of baseball that these folks drummed up is they didn't put that the diamond should be, the spaces between the bases should be 90 feet. They wrote that the distance between home and second sack should be 42 paces. And the distance between first and third sack should be 42 paces. So I found that interesting because, you know, if you use the Pythagorean theorem, of course, that really adds up to about 90 feet or 30 yards from home to first. Now, how they came up with that, it's hard to imagine, but guess what? Those are the specifications of the diamond even today. In addition, one of these gentlemen began playing a position called the short field. Before, lots of the position players would play at their bases, first, second, third, home base, and then some outfielders. And Mr. Cartwright thought that, the throws from the outfield, these outfielders need help getting the ball into the infield. So he started playing between second and third and called it the short field because the throws could be shorter to get the balls in. That's how the shortstop position came to be. So lots of interesting things came about. And this is about in 1845 to 1850 that these Knickerbockers were doing all this, and the game was spreading like wildfire. Another interesting tidbit, in my opinion, is here's a picture in the 1863 where the Union Army is playing a game of baseball with the prisoners of war of the South. Notice there's no gloves. There was no gloves in baseball. And the pitcher who's pitching the ball from here to the batter here, notice straight arm. How do you throw a horseshoe? You pitch it with a straight arm. That's how baseball was played back in those days, and the batter was supposed to tell the pitcher where he'd like the ball pitched. The pitcher was a non-factor in the game, except as a fielder once the ball was pitched to the plate. It was a game between the batter and the fielders, a game of exercise between towns, and, as you can see, between armies and prisoners of war. And they played as gentlemen. There was not a lot of tomfoolery going on at this time, such as stealing bases of all things. Another interesting part of the rules was that balls caught in the fly or on one bounce could be an out. And the rules remained this way for quite a long time because a lot of the people felt that their players would get unduly injured by having to catch balls on the fly. But these East Coasters, you know how these New Yorkers are, they are a very competitive type. And they started saying, we are only going to play, they started experimenting playing just the fly rule, where you're only out on a fly ball in fair territory. And so that idea caught on too for, as the game progressed into the 70s and the 80s. You want to have anything to add yet?
Well, I had a question for you. and this has to do with your comment about playing the game and lack of equipment. It seems like if you had 9 players to a side and the pitcher was delivering the ball to the catcher, that the catcher would have to receive the ball if the batter didn't successfully strike at it. Can you tell us when it was that catchers first decided to start wearing some protection or using some equipment?
Sure. I sure can. Here you can see on this picture it depicts no equipment whatsoever. Let's see. Same here. Someone's getting their head autographed on that one. Let's see if I can find one. Does the catcher have anything on here?
No, but look where he's positioned.
Standing behind the batter, quite a ways back, hardly a crouch. Notice the pitcher is still pitching the ball. So this is more of an 1860s game here.
Looks like an underhand delivery.
Here, I think the catcher has a glove and a chest protector.
So I think the evidence that I uncovered was that there was some use by catchers of equipment, a catcher's mask, a catcher's glove, and even some shin guards. There are pictures that show a catcher taking up his position not 6 or 8 feet or 10 feet behind the plate like some of these photographs, but as the catcher moved up closer to the plate, he would begin getting hit by foul balls, etc. And the managers and catchers decided that if they were going to play a game that employed a pitcher who was going to deliver the ball fast and a faster speed, they were going to need some protection. So between 1857 and 1892, it's generally thought that that was the evolution of when catchers began to use some protective equipment, and it changed the game quite a bit. It changed the game because it allowed pitchers to deliver pitching in a style that wasn't just to throw a meatball up there for the batter to hit. Remember, in the earliest stages of the game, the pitcher's function was just to put the ball in play. As Mr. Westgate points out, that was his function. So the minute that the idea came along that maybe we could use the pitcher's delivery to make it tough for the batter to put the ball in play, that's when the catcher's position changed a little bit, and also the equipment that a catcher might use. Just another note on rules in general. I thought I would throw out some dates for you. Substitution in the early game was not something that was permitted. It wasn't even contemplated under the rules of the game until 1891. In fact, the only way that a player could leave a game was through injury, and he would have to seek permission of the umpire to leave. And there were cases of players who might be tempted in a close game to leave in favor of a more skilled player, and it was up to the umpire to decide whether it was a legitimate injury or not, which again was a real departure from the early fundamental idea of baseball being a gentleman's game. Integrity and honesty was one of the watchwords, two of the watchwords that were used to describe a game that really was designed not to win the game, but to play for enjoyment. The other thing that I think was kind of interesting is that the batting order, the concept of a batting order, did not really come into play until the late 1870s. Before that, there was really no specific rule that prevented a batter from batting once in the first inning and then slipping down at the bottom of the order in the third inning and coming up and batting in a different place. So by 1876, the old timers figured out this isn't a good idea, because this is going to, again, encourage some of the more skilled players to hop around in the order and come up in a situation where they really needed a hit. That distance that the pitcher was throwing the baseball was a big factor in the changing of the game, because in 1854, the pitcher was stationed 45 feet or 15 paces. That's how they used to determine distance, as Mr. Westgate pointed out. It was the same thing for the pitcher's plate. And then it was moved backward for a series of moves through the next 15 years, first to 50 feet, and then eventually in 1893, that magical number of 60 feet, 6 inches first found its way into the rule book. Before that, though, the home team sometimes had the option of setting the distance between the pitcher's plate and home plate. Another change in the game was the umpire's role. That was a really big change that was occurring while these other rule changes, because they were demanding decisions by the umpire that before 1860 they just didn't have to make. So if two players came to a base at almost exactly the same time before 1860, the players were expected to decide whether the player was safe or he was out as gentlemen. They would discuss it and they would come to an agreement. But after 1860, there were many more situations where apparently players couldn't agree. And in that case, the option was to ask the umpire for judgment. And that led into the modern game where we have umpires calling balls and strikes, which again was not part of the game until the 1860s. And then also making judgment where someone was either out or was safe. Do you have some comment, Mr. Westgate?
Sure. Well, the competitive nature of the pitcher evolved to pitchers kept throwing the ball, their arm kept coming up to get more velocity, because they wanted to be more of a part of the game. They wanted the game to be competitive, more so than it was. So that's what brought about the balls and strikes. And finally, by 1884, I believe, the rules for baseball were that the pitcher could throw any way he wanted, because it was very difficult for the umpire to dictate, oh, you're throwing from too high of an angle, you can't do that. How do you know, and the other pitchers, to get around that, would wear their pants up this high so that they could throw from right here instead of down here. And so, and games were getting very long. Since the batters could wait and there were no balls and strikes originally, you had pitchers throwing 300, 350 pitches in the first 3 innings. And so the games became monotonous and long, and so balls and strikes came about from that. Another thing that needs to be discussed, I think, Moonlight, is the running the bases. In the mid-1860s, you could not overrun first base. You could not overrun any base. And so that was a big contention about overrunning bases, because injuries, coming to a short stop. Sometimes you go to play baseball and these players didn't have the time or the money to have spikes, and they couldn't stop short on the base. And Henry Chadwick, who was considered one of the great fathers of the game because of his archiving of all the details, was a big proponent of overrunning every base. So for a while, there was a big argument about, do you overrun every base? Do you overrun no bases? And finally, it was a compromise came about, I believe, around 1871, that, well, why don't you allow overrunning first base and home base, but not overrunning second and third base? That way, you still had the competition of maybe a close play at second or third. People could slide if they wanted. But at first base, we'll give in to the people who want overrunning. We'll let you overrun first. And it has never changed since then. But it was a big contention, yeah.
Do you have any comment on bunting and stealing, the use of those strategies in the early game, and when those strategies started to come into the more modern type of game that we have?
Yeah, well, again, with the East Coast teams becoming more and more competitive compared to Midwest, stealing was never outlawed. It was just an unspoken thing. And once runners realized, I can run at will on slow pitches, they did. And the game was just not enjoyable. If you got a guy on first base, he would just run to second and third because the pitcher was obligated to serve the ball up slowly to the batter, and there's really no recourse. Again, a reason for the pitchers to speed up their delivery. And then, what was the other? Bunting.
Bunting.
Yeah, well, remember this was a sport played mainly by men. Women did too, but mainly by men, and it wasn't very manly to not swing with all your might at a pitch coming into the plate. And it took some cojones, really, just to purposely not hit the ball as hard as you could. And but eventually, the bunt became vogue because, again, like stealing bases, competition. It was an easy way to make first and advance the base runners.
So, stealing is a good example of how the game got changed by a strategy that wasn't prohibited under the rules. Almost any game, if it's played long enough and there's no rule prohibiting something that will give a competitive advantage, is going to catch on in some way. And Chooch is exactly right. The people on the East Coast who were playing the game, who figured that they had invented it, were the ones that were pushing these rule changes and pushing the envelope, so to speak, to change the gentleman's game of the 1850s and 60s to a more competitive game. You have to remember, in the 1860s, these were people who were, the fire chief and the police captain, people who were looked up to in the community, and they were not the type of people that were playing a game so that they could advance their career. They had a career. They were also the type of people that after the game they would throw a potluck. They would entertain the club that came to visit, and this was a time when teams would commonly have their own club song. They would come. There are many examples in the 1860s of teams with songs that were performed at every game. Songs like the Home Run Polka, Tally One for Me. In 1869, the Red Stockings March in honor of the first professional game. So this was an accepted part of the game. One of the reasons that we played the song when we started off today is that it was common in the game that the Grangers and at Greenfield Village is portrayed for those kinds of social customs to have worked their way into the game. And for instance, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, probably the most famous baseball song ever written, wasn't written until 1908, and it wasn't a song that was adopted by a particular team. That was a song that the fans or the cranks would sing before games and after games. It was a song that was written by not a player, but by a newspaper man again. And we go all the way up. Even today, there are examples of teams singing and enjoying songs to promote their club. Does anybody know, for instance, the name of the song that the Tigers had in 1968 when they were fighting for the pennant and went to the World Series? What is it?
Go Get 'em Tigers.
That's it. Go Get 'em Tigers, absolutely. And it was a big hit. National Bank of Detroit put out an album, sold a bazillion copies of it, and it was a way to promote the club. And even today, we still see that. Another thing that was common was either before the game or sometimes even during the game could be stopped by a player or a captain who decided that he wanted to recognize some player on the club for making a good play, for him to stand up and exhort his teammates in a nice huzzah was very common. If somebody hit a triple, that was worth commenting on. Today, players barely speak to each other. You can't imagine anybody doing that. But not only that, but poetry worked its way into the game in the early days. There were many, many examples of poems that were written recognizing the game. The Grangers have been known to deliver a poem, generally speaking, by me, and today is no different. Springtime bringing out the feeling of a new season. I brought a poem in today that I'd like to read that actually was written about 20 years ago. I read it at one of the early spring games that the Grangers were playing against one of their favored opponents, Bay City. The poem is called Ode to Springtime. Today the Grangers start anew to teach the game they love. Their rules are drawn by gentlemen who play without a glove. The lads are pleased to welcome back a group whose hands are tough. Their skills today are on display on our diamond in the rough. Yes, we celebrate another spring, for baseball springs eternal. No doubt the deeds you witness here will fill a sporting journal. So that's the kind of thing that you might have heard at a baseball game back in the 1860s, just to underscore how tough a player has to be to play baseball without equipment, without gloves, without a mask. Again, we have a player in our midst who was famous for playing when he was hurt. One of the first road trips I ever took in 2003 was for a tournament in Rochester, New York. It was called the Silver Ball Tournament. And me, a naive rookie with the club, asked Mr. Johnson, whose nickname was Cue Ball, who's here with us today, what he was going to do about the injury to his hand. It was pretty noticeable. He had a cut in his hand. It wasn't even, can't even discuss it as a cut. It was a fillet, and flesh was coming out. It was pretty horrible looking. I couldn't imagine that he drove all the way to New York with that and hoped to play. And he acted like, well, that's no big thing. I said, I'm going to play with this. And I said, well, are you going to be able to keep the ball from, getting into the cut and infecting it? And he said, sure. And he pulled out a tube. Now, this isn't a vintage, this isn't an older chemical that could have been used, but he pulled out a tube of super glue and he just laid it right in the cut, pushed it back together, and he said, I'll probably have to, put a little more on there about the third or fourth inning, but it'll be good to go. I just thought, I've never seen anybody do that before, but he's an unusual case, as we all know. I already introduced him as one of the most recognized players in vintage baseball, and that was one of the things that he was known for. Another thing that he was known for, he's probably going to get embarrassed and threaten to assault me after this, was he played third base or third sack. And one of his favorite moves was when somebody hit a shot down to third base, he would get down and block it on his knees, pick the ball up on his knees, and make the throw from third base to first from his knees. Now, I don't know how many of you played on a diamond that's a full-size baseball diamond, but that's 120 feet from third base to first base. To hum a throw over to first base from your knees was not something that you saw every day, but if you played on the Grangers, you saw it quite often. Mr. Westgate.
Yes. I have this photo here up on the screen just to exemplify about gloves. I think on this photo, I think the only person wearing gloves is the catcher, or the behind. About 1878 to 1880, there was a fella by the name of Albert Spaulding who decided, you know what, this is really hard on the hands. I don't care what people are going to think if I'm not manly or not. I'm going to put a piece of buckskin on my hand and play first base. Well, guess what? It did not cause quite a stir. People did not show consternation. In fact, the ladies in the audience thought, boy, that was a smart thing to do. The idea caught on, and of course, Mr. Spaulding, as you will know, and this is true, started a sporting goods company, all from the beginning of wearing gloves in baseball. So, but gloves didn't catch on like you would think, like rapid fire. There's a Hall of Famer by the name of Bid McPhee. He did not play for the Tigers. I think he played for the Cardinals. He played till about 1910. Never wore a glove. Professionally, he just thought he could feel the ball better without using a glove, and he could feel it just fine. And he was a fine baseball player. But so gloves started catching on, and there wasn't a lot of money back in the early 20th century. We had depressions. The auto companies were just getting going, and so the players who did have gloves would leave their gloves on the field for the opposing team to wear their gloves. And it wasn't until about the 40s, around George Kell's time, I think, that people started having their own fielding gloves, which was quite an amazing feat, I think, in my research. What do you think about that, Moonlight?
I find it amazing that in the modern game, up until the 50s, players were leaving their gloves out on the field. I don't know that they would do that if it was raining. They might have taken their glove with them into the dugout so they could keep an eye on it and make sure it wasn't going to get damaged. One of the other rule changes, I think, that changed the game quite a bit was something called the fair foul rule. The fair foul rule was, I don't think it was abolished until 1877, but from the beginning of baseball through the end of the 1870s, there were players who practiced this skill that was not precluded by the rules. And the rules at that time meant that if the ball hit in fair territory, no matter where it went after the ball first struck in fair territory, the ball was fair. And so there were not a trainload of players, because it was a tough skill to practice and to perfect. But there were some who were really difficult to get out. And if a team needed a base runner in the ninth inning, they were trailing by a small margin, it was very common for a player to take that bat and chop down on it and hit it inside the foul line and have the ball go directly into foul territory, sometimes 30 or 40 feet down the line, forcing the third baseman or who's ever over there to make a play. So eventually, in the 1870s, with these players who were getting an automatic base hit just about every time they came up, the rule makers decided, you know what, we got to correct that. That shouldn't be happening, and it was eventually eliminated. Another rule change that changed the game quite a bit was the bound rule, which I think Mr. Westgate touched on briefly. That was a rule that permitted a fielder to catch the ball on one bounce fairly to retire the hitter. That rule stayed in effect until the mid-1860s. I think 1865 might have been the last year that it was used. And then Beatles rules came out with a new set of rules that prevented that. And it changed the game quite a bit, because it forced fielders to make an out in the air by catching the ball with their hands, which in turn changed the game from the equipment standpoint, because it was very difficult to catch everything that was hit in the air, especially if it was hit hard. So players decided, they were going to start using some protection on their hands. There's an example on this table over here. When we're done, we put some things out depicting old-time equipment. I'd like you to take a look. Just an early version of a glove is over there. I think it was a first baseman's mitt. It had some padding, but not what we consider modern protection. So, as you can see, they were experimenting with the game in the 50s and the 60s and the 1800s, and that was mainly because they hadn't figured it out yet. And I think there was a confluence of thinking, do we want this game to be played by people who are just having a nice day out and fine weather and taking advantage of fresh air and exercise, or do we want this game to be more competitive? And what we wound up with were two games. A game that is played professionally, that the goal is to win the game, and then the game that is played just for exercise and enjoyment. Both the games can coexist, but the professional game, in addition to having some changes in rules, I think has become more a game of walks and home runs. The early game, and really up until Babe Ruth came in, was not a game where you saw many home runs. It was a game where teams played small ball, what we would call small ball.
The dead ball era.
That's right. And when would you say the dead ball era really ended?
1900 to 1920 is what I think was the dead ball era. Moonlight.
And they not only changed the emphasis on the home run, one of the ways that Ruth popularized it was to make the ball spongier so that it would travel farther. It was hard for anybody but Ruth to hit a home run, and nobody could really cope with that. So the equipment manufacturers, probably our friend Albert Spalding, was out there making a ball that was much more conducive to flying longer distances. But home runs were not a part of the early game, and not really much a part of the vintage game that he and I portray. There is a whole cottage industry that vintage players are aware of, companies that manufacture old-time baseball equipment, baseballs, bats, some gloves, spikes, things of that nature. So the idea of portraying the game back when it was not a game ruled by professionals, when it was not a game that was ruled by pitchers throwing to catchers and only scoring when home runs are hit. It was a far different game then. And so, much as we like the modern game, it certainly has its adherence. The game that was played early on, even though there were some failed experiments, I think overall we find it to be a real challenging game to play and very enjoyable.
Well, speaking of failed experiments, I'm showing a slideshow right now of the first professional ball club in Detroit, which preceded the Detroit Tigers, and these fellows were known as the Wolverines. And it was a failed experiment because after about 7 or 8 years, the club had to fold. They were in the National League, same National League you're familiar with, due to economic reasons. But they did win a pennant in 1887, and here is one of their star players, Charles Bennett, named after the baseball field, Bennett Park. Dan Brothers, I think he was the first home run king of the major. This is Ned Hanlon, who played every 8 years that the Wolverines were in existence. So Charlie Bennett, who Bennett Park was named after, played every year with the Wolverines, and once they folded, he continued his playing career, and unfortunately, he was a very popular guy. He was the fan favorite here in Detroit. The club folded, he went on to continue playing, but his playing career ended tragically about 1894 when he was trying to catch a train and he slipped under the train, lost his legs. Ended up back in Detroit, and they named Bennett Park after him, which is at the corner of Michigan and Trumbull. So Bennett Park was the predecessor to Tiger Stadium, and let's see here if I can find a picture of it real quick because we're kind of running out of time.
Wasn't Bennett Park actually built on the same grounds as Tiger Stadium?
Yes. So
But
let's
the
see.
configuration of the field, I think, was a little bit different.
Bennett Field, there's a picture of Bennett Park right there. Is it popping up yet?
Yeah, great.
That was built in 1895, started being used in 1896, a couple years with the Wolverines, then with minor league baseball for a couple years, and then a guy named Ban Johnson formed the American League in 1901 and invited the Detroit club to join, and indeed it did join. And they were known as the Tigers in 1901. Rumor has it they're commemorating the Light Armory Guard that patrolled Detroit, kept things in order, and they also wore black and orange socks. So that's how they got their name, the Tigers. And if you see Bennett Park here, it is at the corner of Michigan and Trumbull, right where Tiger Stadium was. But if you look at home plate, if you ever were in Tiger Stadium, you know home plate was, what, at the, oh geez. Was it the southeast corner of the stadium? Home plate here
Right.
is the northwest corner of the stadium. So, in 1911, when Frank Navin purchased the club, he moved home plate 90 degrees. And so, if you were ever in Tiger Stadium, where home plate is, that used to be, I think the right field corner of Tiger Stadium was home plate of Bennett Park.
So we've had baseball at that street corner for a long time.
Till 1999. In fact, the Lions and the Tigers have only won world championships
Good
at
point.
that site.
That is true. How are we doing on time?
We're at 2 o'clock.
Well, I think we might have time for a question or two before they throw us out of here. If anybody has a burning question for either of us, we'd be happy to entertain that. If not, we've had a wonderful time today being here and talking baseball.